Last week in the Sustainable Energy module, we covered climate change and the huge impacts on the biosphere, the climate, and so on that our use of energy is causing. So it's easy to say we should just stop using energy, or it's easy to move away from energy. And this week we're talking about how hard it is and how sort of necessary energy is for the functioning of our society, of our economy, and what the difficulties in moving away from the current sort of energy system are. The topics we'll cover firstly are just a review of energy's role in development, and reviewing those other pillars of sustainability other than environment, which are economic and social sustainability. And we'll introduce Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is the global goal on energy. And then we'll have 2 lectures on energy access, the first one on electricity access and the third one on clean cooking access. And then we'll review sort of more classic understandings of energy security from a sort of high income country perspective. And this lecture is to review these pillars of sustainability. So one of these most common definitions of sustainability talks about environmental, social, and economic sustainability. And if all these 3 parts aren't in place, then something isn't sustainable. So environmental here, we can talk about climate change or ecological integrity. The economy and society are embedded within a biosphere. We rely on water, air, and plants and animals to survive. So ecological integrity is maintained. Climate integrity is maintained if environmental sustainability is to maintained. And so Earth's environmental systems are kept in balance in this sort of pillar of sustainability. Economic sustainability then means that we're able to undergo our sort of economic life, that we have, that we're able to have financial resources to meet our needs, that we're able to have livelihoods where we can thrive. We have secure sources of income, and the markets function, and the people can flourish, I suppose. And then this third pillar, social sustainability, is more related to universal human rights, and that everybody has basic necessities, human dignity. Families and communities can thrive and be healthy and secure. That we have democratically elected leaders, things like that. That our cultural rights are maintained, that our personal rights are maintained, that we're protected from discrimination, and so on. So there's this concept of sustainability that without one of these pillars, you can't have full sustainability. So I'd ask you to reflect on what would happen to these pillars, especially the social and economic sustainability pillars, if we just stopped extracting and burning fossil fuels today. So if you could sort of, for climate change, you'd have people say, we just have to stop immediately, that's the biggest thing. I'd ask you to reflect on what the impacts on social and economic sustainability are in pursuing certain actions on climate change. And these sort of barriers are crucial to understanding why progress is so slow, I suppose. So these 3 pillars are in some way inseparable, but they're sometimes complementary. Sometimes action on environmental sustainability can aid social and economic sustainability, but conversely, some actions on one pillar are at the consequence, at the disadvantage of the others. So we have to understand the potential trade-offs and co-benefits in these things. So in the tutorial last week on climate change, I left by asking you what exactly you think energy security means, and I suppose it's here I found your answers extremely good. So some of the 3 biggest words here were energy access, affordability, availability, reliability, and sustainable. Obviously, it underpins everything. Self-sufficiency was something that came up a lot, and basically not depleting resources, something to do with poverty. So kind of at the most basic level, energy security is associated with basically national security. Sort of the concept in the 70s was that sort of a country's national security, in terms of its kind of sovereignty and things like that, depends on availability of natural resources for energy consumption. But there's sort of a much broader understanding of what energy security is, and that is like energy's role in in a functioning society and in a functioning economy. So access to relatively cheap energy is essential basically in the functioning of modern economies. And the concept of lack of energy security is what can happen when that goes out of balance. So this rest of this lecture will be about reviewing energy's role in sort of economic development. And to do that, we review one of the most common measurements of what economic activity is, or economic welfare. Now, GDP is a very common metric used by economists and by the media, and so that's why we go through very briefly what GDP is. So GDP means gross domestic product, and the definition of that is very very defined. So it means the market value basically how much you pay on the market of all finished goods, so finished goods and services, goods like I don't know, bag of potatoes, services, a hair wash at a hairdresser's, or and it's what's produced within a country in a year. And I'll go through some of these particular definitions, or the words in the definitions. So first of all, finished goods and services. These are goods which will not be sold on again as part of another good, and that equally applies to services. So services which aren't kind of part of delivering another service. So those goods that are part of another, sort of producing another good or service, they're called intermediate goods. For example, a baker will sell cakes, but buys flour, eggs, and butter. So the flour, eggs, and butter, the cost that what the price that the baker pays for these things is not counted in GDP, because those aren't finished goods; they're about to be made into something else. But the cakes that the baker sells are counted towards GDP. Capital goods, like let's say a farmer uses a tractor to as an essential sort of good to produce food on the farmer's fields. So the tractor is actually counted towards GDP because it's a capital good, and that's a quick. But basically, it has to be a finished good, not an intermediate good. So GDP counts all goods sold to consumers, not goods and services sold to sort of other services and goods, so that they can operate. GDP also counts goods produced. Only new goods count, or new services. I don't think there's anything as a used service, but for example, a used house doesn't count. So if I buy a second-hand house, that doesn't contribute to GDP. The auctioneer, the architect that might survey it, or so on. Those services do count to GDP, but a used house sold on the market doesn't count. But a new house sold does count. It also measures what is within a country, what is finished and produced within a country. So GDP is counted in the country a good is produced, not where it's consumed. So if a bottle of wine is produced in France and exported to Ireland, then that accounts for France's GDP. But if Ireland produces a load of butter and exports it to France, then that butter is counted for Ireland's GDP. So GDP has a number of shortcomings as a metric. There's a lot of literature on that. I'll let you explore it if you're interested. It is very interesting. About, for example, if I don't clean my kitchen, and you don't clean your kitchen, but we pay each other to clean our kitchens, each other's kitchens, even the same amount, we're both paying each other for a service. So increasing GDP, does that make sense, that like the value of me cleaning my own kitchen isn't counted? Also, things that don't have, basically things that aren't bought or sold on the market are not counted as part of GDP. Market prices are very transparent. They're easy to count. We have to file taxes and we have to declare incomes and sales and things. So it's very easy to precisely measure GDP. So for example, the value of, say, a polar bear, or the existence of biodiversity, or the cleanliness of air, these things are very hard to value. They're also subjective. So it's very hard to measure those things. But when things are not measured in something like GDP, then they're often not considered valuable. Even education is not valued as part of GDP. other things like childcare. If someone leaves the workforce to care for children, that's like a big negative thing, for example. So GDP is just a number. It's important to understand its uses and also its shortcomings. It can be a very useful number to basically measure the total economic activity, but it doesn't measure a lot of other things. How does that relate to energy? So it's very clear that basically GDP per capita is a rough measure of the economic productivity of a country, and the more GDP per capita that a country has, the more energy used per capita. Basically, energy has a very crucial role to play in this global development context. Energy has this big potential to improve living standards, for example, freeing of time from household chores like washing clothes or cooking is enormously labor intensive if you don't have modern energy. It increases productivity, for example, at the farm level, having electricity, having fuels and so on just dramatically increases the productivity of a farm. Factories is the same. Improved healthcare. Can you imagine dealing with COVID ventilators and so on without respirators, without electricity? Education services. You're watching this on a laptop. You're this year doing your whole degree through a computer that's powered by electricity, and digital connections, and connections to markets. So the link between energy consumption and economic growth has been this topic of wide discussion. What drives the other? A lot of studies have tried to measure whether, increasing energy drives energy consumption, drives economic growth, or whether economic growth drives economic basically, what is the relationship between energy consumption and economic growth? There's no clear consensus on what drives one and the other. It's mixed. So it can be the link between energy and prosperity is not, unidirectional. Gaining access to electricity and other energy sources, it can provide an initial increase in GDP. It's a necessary input, but not sufficient. Having GDP then can drive higher incomes, which makes people consume more energy. And also progress and development outcomes can be complex, and different parameters can be improving at the same time. For example, if energy access and consumption improves, then nutrition can improve, education, health and sanitation, they can all be improving simultaneously while driving up energy consumption. So it can be hard to attribute just one development outcome to back to a single parameter. And as you know, as we went through before, the history of total primary energy requirement and our increase in fossil fuel use has been intrinsically linked with the improvement in innovation, in technology, and things like that across the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. So from the development of the steam engine, which enabled coal to be extracted and used at a higher efficiency, which drove the Industrial Revolution, automobile revolution, we started flying frequently, television and telecommunications, microchips, internet. That all has been sort of deeply interlinked with our energy growth. Innovation requires energy. Energy it reduces manual labor, frees us up to do more sort of intellectual tasks, I suppose, and so on. Another factor there is access to electricity. So many people in the world, next lecture is on access to electricity. A high share of people in the world don't have any access to electricity. And that again is very highly linked to GDP per capita. So you can see a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa here where the rate of access to electricity is below 40%. And these also have very low incomes in terms of GDP per capita. Note this is a log scale here. So, Ireland up here as a high income country has 100% access to electricity. Can you imagine having your life without any electricity? You certainly wouldn't be able to productively contribute to the economy. And you can click on these links here. This Our World in Data is very good. It gives you some background information, and you can play these charts over time, which I'd recommend. So the next few lectures are based on this study that I was involved in at the International Energy Agency called the Energy Access Outlook. It was a report published in 2017, and if you're interested in learning more, you can either go onto the website or download the report itself. But the next two lectures on energy access, electricity and clean cooking are based on this report. And as in previous lectures, the modelling is based on certain scenarios. So there's about 4 different sort of cases that we look at. First of all, the historical context. How far have countries come so far in providing electricity and clean cooking access? The new policy scenario, that's the IEA's central scenario, looking out to the future. That, by the way, is now called the stated policy scenario. And that aims to provide this quantitative assessment of where existing and announced policies will lead the energy sector. So for energy access, this report for the first time included this country by country projection of energy access based on historical rates, population growth, urbanization. Policies are very important to driving energy access, as well as availability and price of fuels and technologies. And then this energy for all case was something that we introduced, which was examining the achievement of SDG 7.1, which is the achievement of universal access to energy by 2030. And that quantifies the additional investment needed, infrastructure, and the implications for greenhouse gases, local pollution, health, and energy demand. And finally, the sustainable development scenario, which we'll look in detail at in week 6. And that both includes access to universal energy, climate stabilization, and air pollution mitigation. So next, why was this report? Why did this report take place? Why in 2017? So energy has long been recognized as really essential for humanity to develop and thrive. You know, what I just talked about is not new. But in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by 193 countries at the UN. They marked an evolution from the Millennium Development Goals. So there was 17 Sustainable Development Goals, one of which is fully dedicated to energy. And this marks this new level of recognition that energy is central, a central pillar in this economic, social, and environmental sustainability. So there was this new level of political recognition, and Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, said that energy was the golden thread that weaves together these 3 pillars of sustainability. Interesting thing about the Sustainable Development Goals, first of all, the 17 goals are considered indivisible. There's no one sort of goal that is on top of the others. They're also absolute. They aim for 0 poverty by 2030, universal access to energy, you know, the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the SDGs, aimed at like having childhood deaths and hunger and things like this. This is really striving for vast improvements and absolute improvements in human development by 2030. It also, for the first time, impacts developing and developed countries alike, or high and low income countries alike. So a lot of these goals are also targeted at countries like Ireland. Why else did we undertake this report? Well, to do a country-by-country assessment of how many people lack access to energy. And it found that in 2016, over 1 billion people in the world don't have access to any electricity. And 2.8 billion people don't have access to clean cooking, and I'll go through what that means later. I had a look at the latest numbers from the IEA in the report published this week, and in 2019 the numbers have dropped to 770 million lacking access to electricity, which is great. 2.6 billion lacking access to clean cooking, great in terms of there is progress, but the progress is still too slow, and still projections by 2030 indicate that we're far from achieving this universal goal. But progress also is slower than it should be because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's home to 3/4 of the global population without access in 2019. It's estimated by this report that the number of people without access to electricity is set to increase this year after having steadily declined for the past 6 years. This has grave consequences, especially for women, and nearly half of households in developing countries depend on wood, waste, and other biomass to cook their daily meals. For many, this means spending over 5 hours a day gathering fuel wood, cooking over inefficient, polluting stoves, and that number is estimated to link to 2.8 million premature deaths every year. That's a staggering number of premature deaths. It's also a huge time burden, mainly affecting women and limiting their participation in productive economic life, so preventing this achievement of gender equality goals as well. But also there is a evolving landscape on energy access. The cost of renewable energy is declining, digital technology digital technologies are transforming the way that electricity access is being provided, especially in rural areas. And so there's this new sort of innovation. So this is the backdrop on which this report was built. So is this new political momentum and technology momentum enough to deliver universal access? What implications would that have for greenhouse gases, for livelihoods, for air pollution? And that's what I will introduce you to in the next lectures. So first of all, I'll define SDG 7 for you. So the wording of SDG 7 is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. That's the goal. And as part of that, there are 3 targets. Target 7.1 is by 2030 ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. So this is the more specific target. And then the UN has defined these indicators about how this target can be measured, because you can't set yourself a goal unless you have an indicator or some sort of metric by which to measure your progress. So indicator 711 is the percentage of the population with access to electricity, and indicator 712 is the proportion of population with primary reliance on clean fuels and technologies. And obviously the target is that these indicators reach 100% by 2030. That's known as the energy access target 7.1. There's 2 other targets, 7.2, which is to, by 2030, increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. And that has an indicator as well about the renewable share in total final energy consumption. And 7.3, which is to double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. We won't address these so closely today, but basically these two, 7.2 and 7.3, are known as the clean energy targets, and 7.1 is the energy access target. And then in the next lecture, we'll go through electricity access, and the following lecture, clean cooking.